The Y Curve with Phil Dobby and Roger Hearing.
Is Ukraine on the brink of defeat?
Russian forces have opened up a new front and seem to be heading for Kharkiv, Ukraine's second biggest city.
Western weapons haven't been getting through fast enough to hold the line.
Ukrainian troops are too few and lack equipment to push the Russians back.
Could this summer see Russian military success push Zelensky to a negotiated peace or even collapse?
Or can Europe and America find the resources and the will to prevent Vladimir Putin from claiming victory?
The Y Curve.
So this does feel like the war almost that everybody has forgotten until it's lost, and then all of a sudden it will be front page news again.
Well, that's the thing, and I think this new offensive certainly seems to suggest, we heard all last summer about, there was going to be a big Ukrainian offensive. Didn't go anywhere, so it just stuck where it was. And now Vladimir Putin may be feeling a bit stronger. He's got support from China. Launching, he's got an awful lot of troops. This is the thing, and a war economy now that he's pushed all the factories into producing armaments right across Russia. If he can push through and grab enough land, it's hard to see how Ukraine can hang on.
But I wonder how long can you sustain that for? How long? It's an economics question. We do economics on this podcast.
Occasionally.
How long can an economy produce stuff, weapons, without diverting resources from the mainstream economy?
Well, that's what Russia has done. They've radically.
But can they keep on doing that?
Well, it's a question of what point people say we're not getting what we want in other ways.
Yeah.
But, that's an open question, partly because I think people don't really know what's going on inside the Russian economy. It's very hard to perceive exactly where things are coming from.
But you would have thought it would be inflationary, and that you've got a lot of people who are getting paid for producing those weapons, and they've got that money. They're not using that money to buy weapons. Those weapons are being used to fight the war. So they've got the money to buy limited resources that are available, other resources like food and all that sort of stuff. You would have thought that would, if it went on for long enough, it would be hyperinflationary.
But the long enough is the point, because if he can push it through to a point of winning, then he doesn't need to worry about that. Meantime, Ukraine doesn't have enough people, doesn't have enough soldiers. They're talking about various forms of additional conscription, but the truth is, a lot of people after this amount of time are pretty fed up with the whole thing, obviously, and worried. And meanwhile, the West doesn't seem... the Americans held up weapons for a very long time. Now they've said, yes, OK, they can come through. But what's going to happen if Donald Trump gets into the White House in January?
Yeah, exactly. And before that, Zelensky is, saying, well, we're just not getting enough, fast enough from the West. And so, is it too late already?
And what about Europe stepping up to the plate? We know that the EU is obviously extremely worried, particularly Poland and other countries. But are they prepared to do the necessary to keep Ukraine afloat? That's kind of the question we need to find out the answer to. And to talk to us about that, someone who does know what they're talking about, and that's Christoph Bluth, who's the Professor of International Relations and Security at the University of Bradford. He joins us now.
So, Christoph, do you get the sense that it's almost already too late, that we've had this lapse in the fighting, that Russia has gained a bit of ground, things are moving too slowly for Ukraine? Has the future direction already been set?
I think that it would be too far to assert this at this time. Obviously, Russia has gained quite a lot of momentum, partly because some initiative by Ukraine failed because the defenses were extremely well developed at that time. So they didn't make much progress. And now the momentum has reversed. Russia has used the glide bombs to very great effect. And
just explain. So those are bombs that they're fairly low tech, but very effective. Is that right?
They're very effective. They obviously travel some distance from the planes where they're delivered, so it becomes harder to defend against them because the Russians can actually sit some distance away from the air defenses that the Ukrainians are deploying. But the other element, obviously, for Ukraine has been that it really has had an incredible shortage of munition, especially artillery shells. That has changed now. Now they have enough artillery shells to continue for the time being. So things are improving somewhat for the Ukrainians now. And the Russians are still facing enormous problems. They're losing so many people. Apparently, this week there was a day when they lost 1,700 people in one day. So they're making very slow progress, step by step. And the Ukrainians haven't yet been able to halt that entirely. But it's very, very costly for the Russians in human terms and material terms.
But they seem to be able to bear the cost. It's the interesting thing we were just saying in the introduction, that Russia has turned its economy into a war economy. and they seem to be able to produce enough missiles to be able to produce enough soldiers as well, simply to slog on almost to get whatever they need. Is that correct?
And if there were 1,700 losses, I'm sure that the Russian media wouldn't be reporting on that, of course.
Yes, of course, the Russians are trying to minimize reports about their losses. And it's true, they're willing to throw as much at this as possible. But nevertheless, I think it's not clear that they can take in Kharkiv, for example, at this point, that they can make very major advances quickly at all. It's just basically block by block they're fighting at the moment. And as the Ukrainian forces are getting resupplied now, that's going to become more and more difficult. But there has to be some rethinking on the side of Europe and the United States of how they're going to help Ukraine with this.
Because Russia's not going to give up, are they? I mean, as you say, if they're suffering those losses, I mean, Putin clearly isn't concerned. He is not going to back down. So we have a war where Russia is attacking and Ukraine, Ukraine can do is defend itself, because obviously it's not going to launch counterattacks back into Russia, because that would just escalate the situation. So it feels like this could go on for a long time on that basis.
Absolutely, it could be a long time, and moreover, the problem is if there is an end to the conflict now, where the situation is, it's not really an end either way. Even if Russia managed to occupy much larger parts of Ukraine, that still wouldn't be the end, because then they would face an internal insurgency. So the question is whether at some point the resistance in Ukraine becomes so successful that the Russians realize that they just have to cut their losses, so to speak. We're not at that point anywhere near. That's for sure.
Yeah, so the whole thing goes on for a while. So this, just sort of standing back and seeing where we think this is going to go. You said you think that Kharkiv is not going to be taken, or is unlikely to be taken. Is there not some momentum with the Russians, though, that could make that possible? Because President Putin was hinting when he was in China in the last few days that was, he wasn't his immediate objective, but it might be.
Well, you can't say it's impossible. I'm just saying that it's not an imminent prospect, and the Ukrainians are still quite confident that they can halt the Russian progress. What the Russians seem to be doing at the moment basically is trying to carve out some kind of buffer zone to protect the territory that they've already got and consolidate in some form or other. Now, the big debate obviously has been for quite some time now that some of the constraints that the Europeans and the Americans are putting on the Ukrainians in terms of the use of the weapons may no longer be plausible at all. In other words, the idea that missile systems, artillery systems cannot be used to attack Russian territory at all, that is something that's being debated right now again.
Yes, because the Americans gave a pretty big hint that while they weren't saying they could, they weren't saying that they couldn't use these weapons inside Russia.
I think in America it's the Pentagon that is putting its foot down and trying to stop the Russians, the Ukrainians, from hitting long-range targets from Ukrainian territory inside Russia. And there is some debate now to argue that is no longer appropriate, that this is constraining the Ukrainians too much.
Yeah, well, it gets back to my point, doesn't it? It's a one-sided war, in a way. Ukraine can only defend itself. Russia attacks. And, you're never going to win if all you're doing is playing defense. You've got to get over that center line and move forward.
Yes, because Ukraine has no intention, obviously, of occupying Russia. That would be insane. They just want to disrupt the logistics and the resources that Russia is accumulating near the Ukrainian territory. They have been successful in many respects. I mean, they have obviously disrupted the Black Sea Fleet very substantially, and they have hit targets. They have hit fuel depots, they've hit refineries, and so forth. So the Russians are suffering. I mean, it is costing the Russians a lot. They are now maybe spending about 7% of their GDP on the military. So in the longer term, obviously, that is going to have major consequences inside Russia itself. But for the time being, they can continue, and they've now appointed an economist to the Minister of Defense.
Yes, they removed Shoigu, who was the old defense minister, who many people thought was not very competent. This new man, you think, is better in that role?
Well, I don't know. If you put an economist in charge, there's every chance they're going to lose. I mean, that might be their Achilles heel.
I think the problem that they're facing, and this has been a problem in the Russian military for decades, and even perhaps back into the Soviet period, is that there's so much corruption in the military, because the military is very resource rich. And so there are many people who are taking the resources for themselves in many ways now. So they're trying to make it more accountable and prevent the loss of resources. I mean, one of the deputies of Shoigu was accused of corruption, and there is a lot of corruption in the system. So I think they are thinking now that they need some greater efficiency in the way in which people and resources are deployed. Whether it'll be effective or not remains to be seen, obviously.
But I mean, you wonder how long they can carry on for that. If they are spending 7% of their GDP on fighting this war, that's a slug of money. That's employing resources that are obviously not getting to people for their everyday life. So people will start to suffer if this carries on for a long period of time.
Oh yes, absolutely. Now, at what point that becomes politically important is unknown at this time. For the time being, it doesn't seem to have harmed Putin's position particularly. But the reverse side of the coin is that people are saying now that the Europeans and Americans are not putting in sufficient resources, and there's still a dispute, as you know, about the use of frozen Russian assets, which are not being mobilized for this effort.
Well, the EU's sort of moving on that, as I heard in the last few days, suggestions that there may now be a plan to use some of those frozen assets. Do you think that's going to happen, and would that benefit Ukraine?
Well, it would benefit Ukraine because of the constraints that the budgets of European states and the United States have, especially the United States, obviously, because there had been so much opposition in Congress to releasing these funds. So, yes, more money, but obviously not just money. They need to get the supplies in terms of the military hardware that they need. Ammunition, especially ammunition, has been obviously a big problem.
And where has the ammunition? Where has this been coming from? By and large, the ammunitions. Which countries are producing it, and have they got the capability to step it up? Because, as you say, it's fine if you use those assets as for the cash to pay for those ammunitions. But what about the production capability?
Yeah, I mean, there are very significant production capabilities. There are production capabilities in Germany, for example. There are obviously production capabilities in the United States. And as I say, they have now been able to provide Ukraine with the artillery shells that are necessary. But the Germans have been very adamant not to provide the Taurus cruise missile, which has a further reach.
Again, because they fear it might go inside Russia, is that right?
Yes, and that then Germany would become more closely associated with a conflict against Russia. Now, the way in which this conflict is shaped and defined differs from NATO country to NATO country to some extent, with obviously countries like Poland and the Baltic states being much more willing to and adamant that Ukraine should be supported, and the United States being willing to support Ukraine. Germany hesitant, goes through phases. They have supplied a lot, but sometimes you can see the hesitance is still on the German side.
Why do you think that is in Germany? Is it for historical reasons, or is there something to do with, I mean, in the past, a number of senior German figures have been quite close to Russia, some of the leaders?
Yes, of course, until the end of the Merkel period, in Germany was still strongly committed to including Russia in the European system of states. Although some people would say by the time the Georgia intervention happened in 2008, that was basically a lost cause already. And Germany wasn't able to recognize enough how the situation was shifting. But now that you've got the SPD chancellor in office, he's still in this mindset that one should try to negotiate with Russia and should try to deal with Russia in some way politically. But that seems to be at the moment impossible. I mean, we have to admit, of course, that Germany has changed quite dramatically, because at the very beginning of this conflict, they were just willing to provide helmets, basically. They were not willing to. They have since provided quite a significant degree of military hardware, and they've given Ukraine some of their most advanced battle tanks, for example. But there's still areas where they're unwilling to support Ukraine. And the question of the F-16s, for example, I mean, has taken a very, very long time. And how many of they're going to get and how effective they're going to be still remains to be seen.
When do you think that will happen? Because we have spoken about these F-16, the advanced warplanes, at lots of points, and the Ukrainians were relying on old MiGs at various points, and we now know that the F-16s are coming, and there's training going on. But when will they actually be in action?
Yeah, that's very unclear. I mean, it's obviously very complicated hardware, and pilots need training, but it's taken a lot longer than people anticipated when the idea was first mooted. So there is this kind of combination of political hesitancy and uncertainty, political restrictions that are being put on, and just the sheer logistical issues of getting material together, of training, and all of these factors have slowed it down quite significantly.
And is there enough critical mass in Ukraine to pick up again? So if we get more arms, if we get the ability to start stepping up the defence and the attack profiles, are there enough people? Is there enough logistics? Is there enough experience? Or is it just been hammered away for so long now that even if you have all that extra weaponry, you've still lost that edge?
You don't have the people willing to use it.
The expertise,
yes,
really.
The manpower.
I think the Ukrainians have shown themselves incredibly adept, not only at using equipment that they're getting and being trained on it, but also at being very innovative in terms of the tactics that they're using, and developing new technology, especially the drone production in Ukraine and so forth, has been quite remarkable. They have faced the problem, of course, of manpower. I mean, if Russia has a manpower problem, Ukraine has an even bigger manpower problem for obvious reasons. They have solved this now, I think, for the time being, but that will come up again in future, no doubt, depending on how long this conflict goes on for.
Solved it by widening the number of people they are conscripting? Is that what's happening?
Yes, exactly, yeah. So they have conscripted more people, but
less willing people, presumably.
Possibly. I
mean, you might, the quality of the fighting that you're getting might be going down.
And also, the casualty rate is very high. So the willingness of people to go into what appears to be a terrible death factory must be quite hard.
Yes, but there is some interesting asymmetries here. On the one hand, the Russians have a potential advantage in quantity, but the quality is really poor of the people they've put in there. I mean, compared to the Ukrainians obviously have a very strong reason to defend their entire existence. And so I think in terms of manpower, at least as far as the quality of manpower goes, Ukrainians have quite a distinct advantage over Russia.
So it seems whenever Ukraine gets the upper hand, Russia starts talking about nuclear weapons again. So we had Russia's defense ministry saying it's begun a round of drills that involves tactical nuclear weapons. Is that all just bluster, or is that something we should be very concerned about?
Well, first of all, it's obviously a sign of weakness. If you are supposedly this vast military power, and then you have to fall back on nuclear weapons because you're doing poorly on the battlefield, that is a sign of weakness rather than strength. I think so far it seems clear that the Russians are not willing to risk the use of nuclear weapons because they realize that could bring the war to Moscow, basically. I mean, the Americans have made it quite clear that if nuclear weapons are being used, then these many constraints are going to fall. They haven't threatened, interestingly enough, Russia directly with nuclear use themselves, but there is they've given clear warnings to Russia that the constraints on direct American involvement might fall away if they use nuclear weapons.
But if they use nuclear weapons, even a small tactical nuclear weapon, that would be so devastating to Ukraine that Russia could win the war before these constraints even matter.
Well, it depends on what you mean by winning the war. Will they be able to occupy and control the country? That's unclear to me, even if they use nuclear weapons. Yes, it would be devastating without a doubt. But that doesn't mean it would give Russia what Russia what Russia would want.
Well, as you say, it brings the war home, doesn't it? Because the West is not going to sit by and just watch that happen. There is going to be some sort of response to that in some form.
Well, there have been very clear discussions, as far as we understand, between the United States government and the Russian government on this matter. Now, we haven't been told exactly what the Americans have said to the Russians, but what we can gather is that, first of all, they haven't threatened the use of nuclear weapons, but they have threatened severe consequences, probably in the use of strategic non-nuclear weapons. So,
what would that mean in effect?
Yeah, they could launch targets. Well, Petraeus had said once, and I don't know how much he knows about what's going on in the Pentagon now, but General Petraeus said that if the Russians do this, then they should first of all finish off the Black Sea Fleet, and secondly destroy the Russian army completely.
This is General Petraeus, the former the former general in the U.S. Military, who was very distinguished in Afghanistan and elsewhere.
Yes, exactly.
What we haven't mentioned in all this is the political situation in Ukraine, because there have been issues and question marks over Zelensky and his actions. He got rid of a very senior commander. People were concerned about that, and he now is in a position perhaps where his support is diminishing. Do you think he and his government have the necessary strength in the middle of all this?
Well, I mean, Zelensky has proved himself to be quite an extraordinary leader, given that he was an actor professionally and somehow
a comedian,
have become an accidental president. And nobody thought much of him when he first came into office. And he has been an extraordinary war leader. I think nobody expected that this is how it would turn out.
I mean, it's a bit like us going to war with Ricky Gervais in charge, isn't it, really? We wouldn't be in a good position. But as you say, he's risen to the challenge.
Boggles the mind.
It does. But he's risen to the challenge.
But Christoph, there have been issues recently. I mean, I've certainly seen criticism of him building within Ukraine. I've seen suggestions that he feels his power is under threat, which may have been why he got rid of one of the top commanders. I mean, there are question marks.
Yes, of course. I mean, there are these kind of tensions that, on the one hand, nobody wants to attack a leader in the middle of the war, but on the other hand, there are obvious tensions within the leadership when the issues are so complex and the situation is so dire, and so it's possible that there will be some momentum, but I don't see at the moment that the Zelensky is at risk. There is always this question. I mean, we know obviously that prior to the war, there were lots of issues about corruption in the elite in Ukraine, and these issues have been kind of suppressed a little bit, but they still exist. And war, which is always based on the concentration of a lot of resources, gives again opportunities for corruption. Nevertheless, I think at the moment Zelensky appears to be relatively secure.
And the idea of taking Kyiv, that's just a pipe dream for the Russians? Is the ability to hold the capital, is that still there? For
the time being, I don't see Russia making any quick major gains in Ukraine at all. So I think for most of the year we will see only very incremental increases, and it could very well be that at some point the Ukrainians may be able to take some territory back again. That's very unpredictable. So we can't really predict what's happening in the longer term. I think more important is that really the NATO countries need to think much more seriously how they can take measures that push the war towards a quicker end. Because
what would they be? And you'd think that the end has got to be a negotiation of some sort, but that seems so unlikely because, first of all, neither side wants to talk. What they want is so distant from each other. So, I mean, what is the path to an end? I can't see one.
Well, the only way would be to lift some of the restrictions on the use of Western military hardware, and to enable the Ukrainians to much more decisively disrupt the logistics and the storage of fuels and weapon systems, and and make it much harder for the Russians to fight, that they are at risk of losing substantial ground. And
so So Russia then stops. I can't say Putin doesn't seem like the sort of man who's just going to go, oh, well, we tried. Better luck next time. I give in. I mean, that's not his personality, is it? Obviously.
Yes, but at some point, sure, he is very stubborn. But at the moment, he still believes there's still some reason for him to believe that he can continue and can possibly reverse the tide of the war. And if there's sufficient aid given to Ukraine to make this seem completely implausible, then the attitude to negotiations might change.
The elephant in the room, of course, is Donald Trump. If he becomes president at the beginning of next year, how does that change things? Because he did say, it was a while back now, but he said he could solve the whole thing in a day. I think that probably meant Ukraine would be surrendering a great deal of territory, which would sort of suggest that he's not going to be totally happy about supplying unlimited funding.
But he did let the Republicans in the House of Representatives back in the end, or enough of them back. The delivery of the weapons. So maybe, is it possible to say that he's changed as well?
Well, Donald Trump talks a lot, and he likes to give you the impression that he can solve big problems very quickly.
But he never does.
But
yeah.
No, he doesn't. I think this is a real unknown, and probably even unknown to Trump himself, exactly what he would be doing. He hasn't been willing to be any more forthcoming. One option for him might be, obviously, if he wanted to prove that he can solve the problem, is to escalate American support very dramatically, or it could be the exact reverse. So
it's hard to see.
That is quite
Christoph,
unclear.
One thought occurs as we draw this discussion towards an end, but is it not also possible to say that perhaps a different way of looking at this, to say Vladimir Putin's got himself into a complete mess with this. He's committed himself to something that's draining his economy, seems to be at a kind of stalemate in one form or another. Is there not an advantage, perhaps, to the West and certainly to Europe, if it just stays pretty much as it is? There's limits to what he can do while he's stuck in this position. It's like not interrupting your enemy when he's making a mistake. And that, in a way, a stalemate actually wouldn't be the worst outcome of this for Europe.
That seems quite a slightly cynical way of looking at it.
I'm afraid that's.
But you're talking about, so they hold their lines. They just say, well, let's hold our positions, but let's just not use the ammunition because that's an expense. We won't fight back if you don't fight back.
Well, kind of. But I just think the situation as it is might not be, the worst outcome, as I say, for European politicians who want to weaken Vladimir Putin.
But for how long?
Well, that's the question. What do you think, Christoph?
I think they're thinking about it differently. I think they think that Russia should not be in the position that a nuclear weapon state should be permitted to engage in this kind of aggression, and that Russia should become a state that fits into the international order as it's conceived in terms of international law in the United Nations by Western countries, and that there is a potentially a great space for Russia in the international system, because Russia is potentially a very great country, but because it's seeking to advance its objectives with the use of coercion and military force, that is something that has to be resisted and that Russia shouldn't be rewarded for. Now, that's a kind of very, if you like, a very idealistic perspective, and the end to the war is probably going to be a lot more messy than that. But I don't think they think of it in these terms that, as long as Russia is obviously Ukraine is suffering an enormous amount, and this kind of conflict is very costly for everybody. So if we could see a quicker end to this,
then we should do it. But who would negotiate that? Because obviously a negotiation directly between Russia and Ukraine isn't going to lead anywhere. Getting the United States involved possibly isn't going to be particularly helpful, particularly if Donald Trump is the president. I mean, should we be looking at places that are supposedly helping Russia in all of this? Places like China, for example, where we start to have a discussion where they almost get involved in trying to arrive at what could be.
Well, they've already got a peace plan. The Chinese have put one forward, but it doesn't seem to be what anyone wants.
Well, I think the the way in which I read the Western position at the moment, the American and European position, is that this is a matter that Ukraine should negotiate, but they will, without a doubt, advise Ukraine informally of some of the parameters if it comes to this point. But what we had during the Cold War was a temporary territorial settlement, in the sense that the Western countries never accepted Soviet domination over Eastern Europe, but they always said, we will not use force to change that. And you could see something like this in Ukraine, which it says we accept that Russia is occupying Donbass and these new territories allegedly integrated now into the Russian Federation. So we accept the fact that that exists. We don't think it's legitimate, but we won't use force to change that. Something along those lines.
Right. And then we just accept that everything that's gone before that. So, for example, kids that have been taken away and now going to school in Russia who've been
forcibly abducted.
All of that, we just say, well, that's a bit unfortunate. That was just
not to mention, of course, the crimes of which we have, or the international community has accused Vladimir Putin and some of his staff of doing.
Do we just have a poor memory to all that sort of stuff?
I'm not sure that that's necessarily going to be the case, but the means whereby this is going to be pursued are going to be political rather than military.
The last time we spoke, I think you were saying this is going to be a long war. It seems like you're saying the same thing again.
Yeah, There's 6 months from now, if we talk to you again, Christoph, do you think it's going to be any different?
It'll be different, but we'll still probably be in the war.
And you don't know whose advantage will be at that point that isn't now?
Well, still at loggerheads.
It depends a great deal on whether there is any significant change in the policy of how we are supporting Ukraine, because that would make an enormous difference, because the Ukrainians are very, very adept at using technology, but and the technology, this is an important point. NATO's technology is in many respects, I mean, there's some exceptions, but in many respects about 2 generations ahead of that of Russia. So NATO can help Ukraine a lot. But there needs to be probably some kind of significant change, both in European and NATO and the United States, to reverse the current momentum in the conflict.
Well, we'll see if that comes through. Christoph, thank you so much for doing that.
Thanks, Christoph.
Appreciate your time, and perhaps we'll talk again in 6 months and see where we are. But thank you for being with us.
Okay, thank you.
I just can't help feeling it's got to be a political answer, hasn't it? Otherwise you've just got two sides fighting each other. It goes on forever. There has to be some sort of political solution.
That's why I wonder the cynical point about well, actually,
maybe the answer is we just live with it. Yeah.
And maybe it's not the worst thing because it keeps Putin occupied.
Yeah. Well, so you mentioned war crimes and whether we Putin is not the only man being accused. Well, not necessarily being of war crimes, but the idea that we have the International Criminal Court now with an arrest warrant against the Prime Minister of Israel
and several members of his cabinet, a country that is recognised, has been recognised up to now as democratic and Western-oriented. I mean, it's quite a move, quite the change, and obviously related very closely to everything that's been going on in Gaza. And, of course, there are warrants as well, of course, will be potentially warrants for leaders of Hamas. It's quite a change, quite a step change in terms of the system.
Not well received, obviously, by many Western countries. So does that? But it still stands, though. So if Netanyahu,
it will stand if they get the arrest warrants. They've applied for them. Right. It's not technically there, but it's certainly crossed the line.
So if it was granted, and Netanyahu, for example, arrived in Germany or somewhere in Europe,
potentially he could be arrested,
right,
or would need to be arrested. But there have been lots of arrest warrants out for various leaders around the world, including Vladimir Putin, but others too, and very few arrests. In fact, various people say the only people who actually end up going to jail from the International Criminal Court are former African dictators, and not even that many of those. So to what extent does that system, the International Criminal Court, does it work?
Yeah.
Does it make any sense? Is it justice even?
Yeah.
That's what we're going to have a look at.
And how do they arrive at that decision?
How do they do it? Yeah. We're going to look at that in our next episode
of The Y Curve. Next week, same time. We'll see you then. Thanks for listening in. We'll catch you then.
Bye.
The Y Curve.